Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm speaking to a professor who specialises in risk communication. David Spiegelhalter is the chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication within the Department of Pure Mathematics and Mathematical Statistics at Cambridge University. Listeners in the UK will almost certainly have seen or heard David. Since the start of the pandemic, he's been a regular fixture on TV and radio, helping to make sense of the things we were being told about the virus. In a world of self-appointed experts, whose only qualification is from the University of YouTube, and untrustworthy politicians telling us they're following the science, he's been a voice of clarity and common sense. In our discussion, we explore what drives David's interest in statistics, why we like to see connections between things that might not actually be there, and whether there's such a thing as coincidence. As you might expect, for someone who specialises in risk communication, David is really good at getting his message across in ways we can all understand. There are a ton of insights that he brings. Now, I've wanted to get David on the show for ages. You'll know why when you've heard what he has to say. So I'm enormously grateful to him and to longtime friend of the show, Roger Miles, for helping to make this happen. So without further ado, please enjoy, as I know you will, my conversation with Professor David Spiegelhalter on communicating risk. David, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. I've absolutely no idea why I'm on this. I know nothing about human risk. Anyway, let's have a go.
Well, let's find out, because I have a theory that you do know a lot. And you're being incredibly modest as ever. To start us off, I'm absolutely fascinated. How does one get into statistics? Because if I think back to my childhood, not a career that was obvious to me or that I or anybody else I knew aspired to, and yet you're very passionate about it. How did you get into that space?
That's really interesting. Of course, I didn't know what a statistician was. I had absolutely no idea. But as a kid, I used to collect car numbers. I loved lists of numbers. I loved ticking them off. You could buy books of them and put lines through them. And I used to sit for ages. We lived right on the main road. And I used to sit there, doing car numbers. And I liked lining up my cars in order of their numbers on the bottom of the car and in the catalogue. And I loved all that sort of order to chaos. Everything I put in some sort of order. I'm actually really quite messy. If you could see the shelves behind me, you could see what a mess I am. But actually, I do like to be able to find things. And that sort of, listing, enumerating, I've always loved. But, but of course, you don't do that in school. You do maths in school. And I did maths. I was pretty good at maths. So I went to Oxford to do maths, and I did pure maths. I wasn't interested in applied. And I really liked it, but it got too difficult. Halfway through the second year in Oxford, I thought, this is just too difficult for me. And it was great. It's a lovely feeling. It's a lovely feeling where you're right, I've done what I can. That's it. Okay, I've got to find something else. And I went into stats. I had a really inspiring teacher, Adrian Smith, who's now president of the Royal Society, Professor Sir Adrian Smith. And, I've known him now for 50 years. And, I was inspired right from when I was 18 by him into statistics. So this was both important, but also intellectually challenging and exciting and fun. And so I've always been interested not just in the practical aspects of stats, but I am interested in the sort of philosophy of statistics, of probability. What is probability? Does it exist? And everything. I mean, we probably don't want to get into this, but I'm actually as I was trained to be then, I'm quite a radical subjectivist Bayesian. So that's my particular philosophy of probability and statistics, which puts me out on a bit of a wing, but I've never changed my mind. So for example, I don't think probability exists as a property of the external world, apart from at a subatomic level. All probabilities are judgments made on the basis of our available knowledge. The whole of statistical enterprise is constructed, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's always been very helpful. So, then I just also then found I actually liked doing the problem solving, because stats is problem solving. And I just enjoy it. I started working, with real data for people, and I loved this feeling. They come in, it's like being a counselor. You know, the situation. You walk into a room. There's a box of tissues in the table in the middle, and this sort of thing. It's all familiar to some of us. And someone comes, oh, I'm terribly well. I got my experiment, and it's all gone wrong. Just sit down, calm. Just explain it to me. Let me help you. Tell me more. So you go into this counselling mode, and it's great. I love trying to deal with other people's problems. It's lovely.
And so this is really about making sense of the world.
Mm.
And it struck me that your desire for order that you described, we do like to sort of understand what's going on and have a sense of why are things happening around us? What do I need to know to be able to survive, I guess, at its most simplest. And so you're taking something that's very challenging and nebulous and grey and difficult and sort of bringing some order to that.
Yeah, my when I met my current partner, she made me a sweatshirt sort of the order and chaos, because bringing order to chaos, as I said, order and chaos down on each arm. It was wonderful. It looked really spooky, in fact. Yeah, that's it. But the crucial thing is realizing the limits of order. That is the real role of statistics, because you can't explain everything. It's exploring the limits of essentially explainability of what you can model, what you can understand, and then acknowledging, woof, there's loads of stuff out there we just don't know about, either because we can't know because it is essentially unknowable, or because we just don't know, and separating out of those two. So you separate out what you know, what you don't know but could know, and what you can't know, and that's what statistics is doing all the time. And it's really it's an exciting enterprise. And so it's trying to bring order to chaos, but realizing that there are limits to that. Be clear about that.
And that, of course, feels very uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
I think we all have a natural desire to know what's going on.
Apophenia is a lovely word. It's the human urge to explain things when have explanations for what actually you can't explain. And we all want to spot patterns. We all want to have reasons for everything. Why does this happen? Why does someone do this? Why? Well, poof, and it's great as a statistician. So, well, absolutely no idea. That's going to technically we put that into the error component of the model. You call it error. It's not, doesn't mean mistake. It just means unexplainable by what we know. Well, maybe that'll narrow in the future, but maybe it won't. It's like you can think of it very clearly when you give probabilities for future health events. What's the chance I'm going to live 10 years and things like that? Well, there's a probability. As you learn more, you find out more about me, my genes. Those probabilities will tend to zero. They'll go up or down. They might go towards one. They should tend towards certainty to some extent, but they'll never get there. There'll always be this unknowable element there, which we can call chance, fate, fortune, goddess of fortuna, whatever you want to call it. It means it's the bit we can't explain, and we just have to live with it. And this, I think, is my crucial thing, which I think I've actually genuinely taken into myself in terms of my attitudes to life, is the acknowledgement of our lack of control and of so much of what happens, and we just have to accept that.
And it strikes me that one of the reasons that we have joy and the opposite, obviously misery as well in our lives, is exactly that random element, that we can't predict certain things. And so that's how we stumble across an amazing restaurant, or we meet somebody that we never thought we would meet. Equally, it's how awful things happen to us.
And that is so true. I've had to be trained out of it, because I was somebody younger in particular who wanted to eliminate the role of chance and error in my life. So holidays is an absolute classic. How much do you plan? Do you plan holidays? Where you going? Do you work out what you're going to do? Where you're going to stay? What you're going to do each day? Where you
I try and balance it, right, so that I capture both, so that I don't have a horrible risk of going somewhere and not having a hotel to stay in. But equally, I want those serendipitous moments.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have to gamble a little bit and say it could be awful. But
My partner, who I love dearly, I didn't just get on a plane and arrive. And we did it. No, I'm very proud of it. A few years ago, we flew to Mykonos and got off the plane, and we'd absolutely nothing booked whatsoever. And it worked brilliantly. It gives me the willies now, this, because things are so uncertain. So we'd just been on holiday to Greece. We planned the first bit, and the rest of it was serendipitous. And we did it as we went along. And that was just worked out perfectly because we changed our plans. So we reached a compromise on that. I love the serendipitous nature. We went to India, just before the pandemic, for 6 weeks, and we booked the first night. That's it. And so
Wow.
that's I got better. I've had to learn. It's really been painful, but I've had to learn to open yourself up to what might happen.
And it feels inefficient because at least when you've mitigated the downside, you've booked the hotel, you know
Yeah.
what you're going to be doing. That feels like a more efficient use of time. So,
Yeah.
so from a logical perspective, that seems to make sense. And yet, from an emotional perspective,
Yeah. I should bring my place. She's out. I should bring her in. She'd have a real rant at you because she says I'm a terrible optimizer. I want to make sure I don't miss anything when I go somewhere. And in fact, I am. I don't want to come back and realize, oh well, if I'd gone a bit further, I would have seen X. And everyone said, oh, wasn't that wonderful? And I said, well, I didn't see it because I didn't.
I'll take your word
It's
for it.
happened. No, I've done that a number of times. I got someone, what did it? I didn't know. So no, I do like to make sure that I'm not disappointed. Fear of it, I mean, this is the human risk bit of it. We know that fear of regret is a very powerful emotion, and I've got it. I think I've never shifted from that. I don't want to regret things. So I wonder, that's why, in a sense, I do want to open myself up to possibility, but I also want to make sure that actually, it's what I give a lot of. I used to do a lot of talks to kids about risk, and I used to explain about risk and show pictures of me jumping off cliffs and skydiving and this sort of thing. And I say, I was taking some risks then, but I wasn't being reckless. I was checking. So you should take risks, open yourself up to serendipity, but make sure you mitigate. You're resilient against both disasters. So you don't do stupid things, and that another stupid thing to do is miss something really good, miss out on a powerful experience that you would really value and not get it because you just didn't think about it or you weren't aware of it. So I think that's a risk. So I think taking risks is great, but don't be reckless.
And of course, there's a fine line there, and it's a matter of perception.
Yeah, yeah. But I think the main element about it is regret. That's the way. I mean, in a way that you only identify afterwards. The regret is a retrospective emotion, but it's made important by. I think it is reasonable to avoid potential regret. Yeah.
And it strikes me that one of the challenges we have, which sort of brings us firmly into some of the things that you look at, is that there's so much data out there nowadays that in many respects we have no excuse. So if I take your holiday example, not knowing
Yeah.
that there's an incredible restaurant, museum, place to take a picture is a bit more embarrassing now because we have the wherewithal to find out, and we could do our research before. And that, of course, applies to a whole host of other areas where we're sitting on more data than we've ever had as a
Mm.
species before. And so that ought to make us better informed. And yet, it seems to me we're not capable of processing it.
Yeah, but there's so much, and actually, that data often isn't very good, and it's repetitive and sources. If you do, want to check on where you're going for holiday, carry on that analogy, you end up finding the same sources. People cross-referring, and actually, can you really believe this? So much so that again, in listening to my partner, I find the best philosophy is just to ask other people, is to use the personal recommend. It's interesting that given the vast amount we've got online, in the end, my main advice to people is to ask others, to talk to what I regard as experts, people who've had that experience, take advantage of that personal experience. And I think you can see that happening even online. The power of storytelling and personal experience is become even more important given the vast amounts of just stuff out there that we can explore and we try to navigate. Again, that's not the only answer. You can't find, because the thing that really pisses me off about the whole pandemic stuff are all the sort of skeptics and vaccine skeptics who say, oh, I've done my own research. I mean, that's oh, Christ. So what they've done, because there's so much stuff out there, they've identified some arse on YouTube who doesn't know anything, but who's got a nice soft tone and sounds very accepting and I'm just raising questions and this sort of thing. And they believe them because actually they don't trust the authorities. They certainly aren't doing their own research because that's actually quite difficult. And I don't do my own research when I want to find out about vaccine effectiveness. I go to somebody who knows about vaccine effectiveness and find out what they say. That's it. But I know who to ask and who to talk to, and they don't. So they find some person who is actually incompetent, not a trustworthy authority. So I think this, the doing your own research of finding things out, in this way, just almost the personal experience. Because, so I'm saying for my holiday, I do like to do my own research. I want to hear somebody who's telling a story about it. But it's different from finding out about vaccines, where I don't want to do that. I want to find the most trusted authority I can find and go for them. So these aren't universal laws at all. It's very human how you respond. But I hope I can distinguish between seeking evidence about which pub to go to and seeking evidence about whether the vaccine's going to kill me or not.
Right, right. Very different types of expertise. Although it's not out of the
Yeah,
question
yeah,
that people are experts in both,
yeah,
but
yeah. But I wouldn't necessarily trust one person who's good at one to be good at the other.
you talk about storytelling, and I'm fascinated by the concept of what I've heard referred to as anecdata,
Yeah,
which is this combination of anecdotes and
yeah,
data.
yeah,
And therefore, the simple logic that data tells you what's happened and anecdotes tell you why.
yeah.
And then the sort of I was about to say Steve Jobs, not Jeff Bezos piece, where he says, "Well, look, we look at both and we decide where there's a disconnect between the two. Let's go get some more anecdotes."
Absolutely. So I mean, this is something we struggle with all the time because you realize with data that in the end, if you're going to communicate what it means, what it doesn't mean, you got to embed this in a narrative. You've got to be gripping. Well, we might talk about this later, but the people I work with and me are obsessed with this idea of trustworthy communication. And I think we've explored that a lot. I kind of feel I know what that is now. But we also say there's no point in being trustworthy if you're dull. And so you've got no one's going to take the blindest bit of notice of you. So you've got to actually be gripping, and people, including me, of course, are gripped by narratives, by stories, by anecdotes about people. Now, how do you produce, and this is something that people are now studying in quite a systematic way, how do you produce trustworthy narratives? And I think they're ones that do take exactly this, what we call a mixed method approach, whether it's anecdote or whatever. In other words, they combine the quantitative and the qualitative. So, qualitative, whatever you pronounce it. Anyway, so you do need the data. You need to be true to the data. You need to know what's actually going on in the world as a whole. You absolutely have to do that. It's absolutely essential. But that is not enough. Um, and so, for multiple reasons, you also want to tell that story through individual experiences as much as possible. But those experiences should genuinely reflect the bigger whole. If you only pick the extremes, you only tell one side, then it's deeply selective and deeply untrustworthy just to reflect those particular stories. But if you're telling stories that do in fact reflect the what's going on in the population, I mean, you can't do it exactly, but if something is happening to 75% of the population and you got four stories in there, you should have roughly have one in which one thing's happened and three in which the other. So the stories themselves show the weight of evidence. Doesn't have, you can't do this exactly, but it should genuinely reflect that variety of experience, because it's by having multiple stories that you reflect the most vital thing to everybody, which is variety, variations. People think statisticians just study averages. No, averages are average average. What we really are interested in the variability. And so we're interested in the whole spread of experiences across the whole population. And trying to reflect that is quite tricky. And that's why actually storytelling, multiple narratives of different multiple experiences, is actually a really scientific way, I think, to communicate the variety of experience in the population. But it's got to be trustworthy. It's got to be honest. It's got to reflect what's really going on. And so this is something that people are exploring. What is if you're going to, I mean, Jeff Bezos is talking about how to learn. And that's one thing. That's obviously one should be learning both by qualitative interview, experiences and data and things. But also I'm thinking about communication. If you wanted to explain to somebody the state of the world and people's experiences in the world, then you need to combine the two. And good data journalism will both show the data and also reflect with the experiences. And good journalists do this all the time. And you can see some go towards the data more than and some, but they'll often lead, of course, with a personal story, but then use the data to sort of back it up. So, in a sense, this is good journalism, as they know about this. But also, I think it goes outside that towards even scientific communication. If you really want to engage people and get them to try to understand what's going on, then you need both elements.
I've heard you talk before about the sort of responsibility on academics and researchers, that you can't just put your findings out there and expect them to land in the way. There's a need to think about that and pre-communicate so that people have to, and make sure that your message is landing. And so if it doesn't land correctly, I've heard you suggest that that's on the researcher.
This is a really, really difficult, finely balanced issue because, yes, there's a quote I use all the time in my book, and It's from Nate Silver in his book, Signal and Noise, where he says that the data it doesn't speak for itself. We imbue it with meaning. And that's absolutely true. Data does not give up its messages automatically. You can put graphs, you can do everything else. It doesn't say it is on the responsibility of the researcher to help with the interpretation and pre-bunk the misinterpretations. Get in there and preempt misunderstandings and make sure you say very clearly, this data does not mean X. And then be very clear about what one can conclude from the data. But making clear also that there's an element of judgment in there. This is in our opinion, and it's very interesting to see what the Office for National Statistics does, which they're always on this balance. I'm a non-executive director, so I'm completely biased. But they produce the data in a very, very objective. Here's the data. But they will also, include a statistician says paragraph, so where they do give some interpretation of what's going on. I think they could do a bit more, but they're very cautious about that. The problem is, it's so easy then to say, oh well, this is what the data means, and therefore this is what should be done. And I think that is absolutely forbidden as a line beyond which statisticians and scientists should not go unless they're clearly operating on behalf of an advocacy organization, because they have stopped being scientists, they've become advocates. And this has really irritated me throughout the pandemic, that so many scientists have, I feel, gone way beyond, out of their lane, gone beyond interpreting the data towards this is what the data means for public policy and therefore we should do X. I think this is unacceptable. And I think I've been ranting on about it for 2 years now and will continue to do so. And this includes, many really quite prominent scientists who are on Twitter and, get on the media saying what should be done. I think that's not your job. That's not your job. What are you saying? Why are you saying this? Who gives you the right to say what the public policy should be?
That takes us into the phrase that's been used quite a lot by politicians to justify their decisions is we've been following the science.
Oh, God, bollocks. Oh, that is the most awful phrase. That is outrageous. They did stop doing that. I think they got such a telling off for that. It's absolutely outrageous to say that. And nobody, when it was, because it's an attempt to shift responsibility when it's sideways to Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance and avoid the responsibility, which is essentially a political responsibility for the handling of the pandemic. They are making the decisions. They are ultimately responsible. This attempt to evade responsibility by saying you're following the science is outrageous and completely inappropriate because the science doesn't tell you what to do. It's not out front guiding the way. It doesn't tell you what to do at all. It might say for certain measures, if you do X on certain restricted measures, this is what might happen with great uncertainty. That's it. Doesn't tell you what to do, because there's always elements about any decision that are not being measured by the scientists. There's huge uncertainty. So unless it's absolutely barn door obvious, it doesn't tell you what to do. What you do is a political decision and they take responsibility for it. So that phrase is absolutely outrageous. I always give the image that the science isn't out front telling you where to go. It's sort of wandering along beside you, staring at its feet, muttering to itself, saying, well, if you go that way, oh, this might happen. If you go that way, well, that might happen. But I don't know. And that's what science is doing.
That phrase suggests it's a gospel. And if we just slavishly follow what it says, and to your point, actually, there's a degree of uncertainty there. And it's not as if there's a perfect solution. In most cases, there's a trade-off.
Yeah, I know if anyone uses the phrase following the science, it's just an immediate indication they don't know what they're talking about, along with, I've done my own research. Two trigger phrases that are very useful to identify particular types of people. So, it doesn't tell you, but of course it's unbelievably valuable. Good information. I mean, otherwise you're flying blind. And so you have to have good information available. And that's what, and I got to be true. I got a huge conflict of interest here, but this country has excelled internationally and has got a massive international reputation in terms of the quality of information, statistical information that's been available to the public and to the decision makers.
And there's going to say open data.
and I guess the sort of logical extension, open research, and we're getting access to things that we would never have access before. So
Mm,
in the right hands,
mm,
seems to me to be very powerful, and
mm,
it's what we should be encouraging. On the
mm,
other hand, it clearly allows charlatans
mm.
and
Yep,
bullshitters
yep,
a lot more ability to back up their nonsense.
yep. It's a risk we have to take. It's the penalty for the trade-off for transparency. We have to take that risk. We have to get the data out there. It has to be open and public, and just try to make sure that the responsible analysis and voices are loud and clear, and that the irresponsible and even malicious analyses that go on are suitably either best of all totally ignored, or are or are countered, actively countered. At best is to ignore them, I think, because otherwise you draw attention to them. There's some, and so there's just been a preprint come out, which I think is on using publicly available vaccine data, claiming that the vaccines are causing more harm than they a preprint. I don't even want to draw attention to it because it doesn't seem to have had much mainstream coverage yet, but it's getting huge numbers of downloads, and that's on publicly available data. And that's the price you have to pay. It does mean, I think, though, that if you, with that transparency of data, opening it up, you have to make it so clear in a way what you should also make clear what you can't do with it. It doesn't stop people. No, it's free speech or whatever. I think it's a price we have to pay, and we just have to make sure, try to ensure that the good analyses are outweigh. Because if you try to keep things secret, then I think it always comes back at you. Because then the what I would call the negative elements, whatever you want to call people who are I think promoting misinformation, can then have always got that extra tactic that, oh, they've discovered this data.
In their quote unquote research.
Yeah,
Right.
they've done their own research. They've discovered this data. Well, no, it's always there. So I think that's good. You've got to have it out there, but very publicly, um, you know, clearly explained. And then you've got to explain. There will be debate about the interpretation of data, quite rightly. And so open it up. Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
It strikes me that there's room, and clearly there's lots of things that we should teach kids and I guess adults that haven't picked it up at school. So sort of data literacy
Yeah,
seems to me, and critical thinking are
yeah.
becoming much more important.
It's so important. I'm on various, working parties about, trying to think about how this is best brought into the curriculum. People have, of course, been saying this for ages, and it's been, for example, a part of the International Baccalaureate for some time. It doesn't fit well into our appallingly siloed British education system, which has got worse under this government, of everything by exam and even more siloed approach to education. So how you bring in this, because we're talking, I mean, data literacy, I think is a good term, and that's both the literacy to be able to do even basic analyses of data, and certainly then to critique other people's analyses, what questions to ask. And so there's two things go together. I think they're all part of a whole, and best learned together. By having classes where people, actively, once people do one part of a class can do one analysis, another part, try to take it apart, and you always deliberately play games where you deliberately try to misrepresent what you found and see if the other side can identify what you've done and things like that. So I think just to find out the tricks that people use to promote misinformation, there's some good misinformation games out there at the moment. So I think this is all part of education in modern citizenship. Where it fits in the curriculum is difficult. It's not part of maths. It uses some mathematical thinking, but it uses all sorts of other thinking as well. So it's not part of maths. It's not part of any subject at all. It's just generic skills. But they're also skills that are enormously valuable to future employers. Analytic skills and modeling skills, and the ability, though, to critique what other people have done, what questions to ask when they're presented with an analysis or data or graphs. It's an incredibly important skill. But how does it fit into education? The whole world's struggling with this. This is not unique to this country. Everyone's trying to do it. And different countries are coming up with different proposals. I personally think, a statistics and data science, I think that's quite a good label, strand, as a separate strand from both computing and mathematics, might be an appropriate model. And then people are doing that in different countries, are trying that out. So that's my personal feeling. but I'm not totally committed to anything yet. I really am uncertain how best to do this, except it's got to be done.
It seems to me that people do need help with this. And if we look at advertisements, so take financial services products, for example, very heavily regulated what claims you are allowed to make.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we know that without that, people will make wild claims. And then we have certain, you move into the world of politics, and it's more conventions as opposed to hard enforceable rules about lying or misrepresentation. But we recognize that as humans, one, will have a willingness to push a particular line, and two, that people are susceptible to that. And so it seems to me that we almost need to help people on a day-to-day basis. So even if we had that in the education system, that would be a great start. But clearly there's a load of people that have missed that. And so I wonder, what are your thoughts for the average adult? And we, lots of examples that we can think of in the UK where people have been encouraged to cast a vote in a particular direction that perhaps they wouldn't have done if they'd fully understood things.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's that's a huge issue that goes way beyond just the statistical stuff. But I think if you think of the success of programs such as More or Less on the radio, okay, that's still only for a Radio 4 audience, quite selected, but that's been staggeringly successful. And it's all just to do with taking numbers apart, critiquing numbers. That's all it is. It's extraordinary that, it has been, as a radio program, so massively popular. And so I think that people but it's actually, when you teach this stuff, people love it because suddenly they feel you've got some extra knowledge will give them in a way a step up over other people. They can say, oh, well, that you see the trick they're playing. I think it's a really valuable skills. I love showing, presenting stuff, saying, okay, take that apart. The usual thing is make this number look big or small. I can make any number look big or small. Give me a number, I'll make it look either frightening or reassuring, and just by the way I frame it. And so it's lovely to teach those things because people just realize how they're being manipulated the whole time. And this idea of manipulation, I think, is what it comes down to in communication, is that, the first rule, thing about trustworthy communication to ask is, am I genuinely being informed or am I being persuaded? What does this person, how does this person, why am I hearing this in the first place? First question to ask, why am I hearing this? What is the motivation of the person who's communicating this to me? Do they genuinely want to help me understand an issue so I can make a more informed choice? Or are they trying to manipulate me into either doing something, buying something, or thinking something? And almost always it's if they're trying to manipulate me into being interested, that's perhaps fine. In other words, are they telling a good, engaging, vivid story? That's okay. They've got my interest. So a clickbait headline in itself is not a bad thing. It's got me interested and made me want to read it. But if that clickbait headline is actually misrepresenting what's really going on, they're trying to either frighten me or reassure me, that's actually outrageous. And so these are natural things that it's quite, since we always want to find things that reinforce our own feelings, we're all subject to that confirmation bias. It's quite difficult to exercise that sort of critical judgment. And I do it when I see numbers. As soon as I see a number, I don't believe it. I got my approach is what I call, the Groucho Marx joke, I'd never join a club that would have me as a member.
Yeah.
The very fact that I'm seeing a number in the news is reason for me to disbelieve it. Because it wouldn't be there unless someone was trying to persuade me of something to make it
right.
More. So the very fact that you're being told something is a reason to disbelieve. Now, some may think this is cynical. I don't think this is cynical. This is a slight skepticism.
But it's a good start point.
It is a good start point to be deeply suspicious of anyone who uses the number in an argument, because they're almost certain to be manipulating.
Right. Intentionally or accidentally, I guess.
Yes. They may not realize that they're doing it, but they're choosing the framing of the number is chosen in a way to make you feel the way they want you to feel. It's made to look very big by having lots of zeros, millions and schmillions and things like that. Or you can make numbers look small. All you have to do is divide it by the population of the country and suddenly the number looks quite small. So it's sort of, you can do what you want on this too.
And I've heard you talk about how things you have said have been misrepresented by the media. And I think it's fascinating because clearly you're somebody who is trying to enlighten people, but often the words that you use, the examples that you pick, have been taken completely wrongly and manipulated.
Yes, yeah. I mean, no, I've made, and my colleagues, we've made every mistake possible. I have been everything, that could go wrong has gone wrong, I think. So And sometimes it's just genuinely pointing out an issue and then explaining it. So, for example, the classic one was a year ago when it was noticed that most people who died of COVID had been fully vaccinated. So the majority of deaths, and that's carried on. And so nearly everyone who dies from COVID has been fully vaccinated. Um, and um, and we explained why that's the case. It doesn't mean the vaccines don't work. It's just that nearly all vulnerable people have been vaccinated. The vaccine isn't perfect. It's just like seatbelts. Most people who die in car accidents are wearing seatbelts. Doesn't so, but that is still Bolsonaro used that data to show the vaccines that claimed of killing people. You use and it's all UK data publicly available, and he used that. Trump, advisors have been saying, "Oh, this is why vaccines are so dangerous." It comes out again and again and again. Oh, that's why vaccines are killing people because most people who die have been vaccinated. Well, because nearly everyone's been vaccinated. For Christ's sake, really. Anyway, so that was just point, and we were really blamed for pointing this out, and because people only took the headline and didn't take the explanation. So that was one thing where the other thing is just where I haven't explained things very well, because very early, actually last March 2020, 2 years ago, right at the beginning, I identified that the risk of dying if you caught COVID was roughly the same as the risk of dying this year in a year's. So essentially, you packed a year's worth of risk into a few weeks if you got COVID. And I just said that, it's about the same. And this was quoted by Katie Hopkins and then in the Sun thing saying, oh, well, therefore, your risk of dying isn't increased if you get COVID because it's the same as the risk of dying this year. I said, it's the same. So therefore, it's double. You've got two things. You got two of them. When they're the same, you've got two apples. You can say they're the same. It doesn't mean they're exactly the same apple. You've actually got two apples, for goodness sake. So I didn't say, therefore, it doubles your risk of dying this year if you get it. And I got a terrible misunderstanding of that. Because the graph showing your annual risk and the graph of risk you got COVID went right on top of each other. And I wanted to show they were the same. Therefore, if you got COVID, your risk was doubled, but I didn't make that clear enough. So that was my mistake. My bad communication led to appalling sort of misunderstandings and blame, abuse on Twitter, and the usual stuff.
COVID must have been fascinating, which brings us nicely to your latest book, as a sort of suddenly, oh, right, this is a sort of a moment in the spotlight, I guess. Is that the way it felt to you, that suddenly here's a subject on which I can really engage people because they're focused on it?
Yeah, well, I didn't think it'd last so long for a start, because I was hopelessly optimistic. I thought, it'll just come and go. It's a passing phase. I was retired and getting ready for a nice quiet time. And then suddenly I did a news night on March the 3rd, which was quite early.
Wow, yeah, that is early.
Yeah. And I remember that that's when the guests didn't shake hands with the BBC team. First time. I wasn't wearing masks by then. And I'd just been in a crowded bar, but it's pretty useless, really. But we didn't shake hands. That was interesting. Yeah. So March the 3rd. So that was the first thing, and then of course it just grew and grew and grew, and there was this bottomless demand, which wasn't just me, but people. And I'm pleased I did it, but it was quite stressful, because of the endless demand. And I enjoyed it, and I think I did enjoy it, although it was stressful. Trying to always, as I emphasized before, just stay on the element of explaining things. Partly because I didn't know what to do, so I'm glad that, if someone asked me, well, what should we do? I said, I've no idea, not my job. But it also because genuinely I didn't know what to do. So who am I to say, I didn't have enough strong opinion. And so it was great doing it. And I really enjoyed some of it. Did a lot of, Today programs, quite a lot of television. The ones I enjoyed most were Jeremy Vine, things like that, which is great, where you're just in between the records, and you get phone-ins, and they get you say, oh, they like you, so they keep you on for a while, and those are really good gigs to have. And I felt it was a real privilege to get, as a sort of academic professor of risk or whatever, to get a chance to do that sort of communication was a real privilege. Yeah.
One of the things I think is in that quest for answers. The sort of, I was just looking at your title. You would sort of say, he must know what he's doing, right? Well, here's an expert, right? So we'll just ask him also. So I could imagine that you could very quickly stray into territories that you weren't comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, it's what the risk is terrible because everyone, so many people work on risk and they assume you know about it. And I know nothing about almost every area of risks that people work in. So I've had people say, "Oh, well, come and talk to us about pensions. You must know about that." And I don't know anything about that. I don't understand my own pension, for heaven's sakes, and or investment risk. I know nothing about it. I know nothing about. I don't really know about health and safety. I certainly don't know about risk management and resilience of organizations. I don't know any of this stuff. I will not almost know. So words like risk are very, you should. I now don't say I work in risk because it's just so people always think about their bit of the risk world, which is endless. But just generally trying to keep out of areas you don't know, um, which is because I used to think I was on the media, and if someone asked me a question, I had to answer the question.
Right.
What a delusion! No, I did before the pandemic, but I learned and I practiced and got support from my partner on this, on the wording to use and how to have the tone when someone asks something you don't want to answer. And rather than apologizing, I used to just laugh, and just say, no, I don't know about that. Look, I'm a statistician. Why should I know about this? So, I wouldn't talk about blame about what's happened in the past. I wouldn't talk about what should be done. And I wouldn't talk about what's going to happen in the future. And I'd said that on the Today program. So, what else have we got left to talk to you about?
Well, you invited me, right? It's not like you
invited me. Let me. And I thought, one thing live. I said, "Could you ask me about something I actually know about, please?" And then they did, and it was to explain what was going on. What do all these numbers in the news mean? Can we believe them? How reliable are they? What's actually going on? What technically I'd call epistemic uncertainty. So my expertise in it is in epistemic uncertainty, which means understanding the limitations of our knowledge. What do we know and what we don't about the state of the world? And you can actually do quite a lot on that because we haven't known what's going. With the trends, what do these numbers mean? How many people are dying? Is it going up or going down? Are they dying of COVID, with COVID, et cetera, et cetera? Just explaining all these numbers is a full-time job. Even without talking about who's to blame or what's going to happen and what should we do and all that stuff, I won't talk about. But I'm very proud. I actually, for some reason, I even went on, any questions on the radio. And they asked me on questions, and I just said, I've got absolutely no idea at all. You have to ask somebody else. And that was it. And I shut up. And they said, well, no one's ever done that before.
Well, because often it's politicians on those shows, right? And they're exactly the opposite.
They're complete opposite. I actually terrible. I almost feel sorry for having to have an answer. They get the Minister of Transport on, and he has to answer stuff about immigration. So, and I think, for goodness me, but he is a politician. But I don't have to do that. I could just make a joke out of it. And it was wonderful. I was on Nick Robinson's appalling on Radio 4 because he always asks, you talk to the researcher beforehand and sort of agree what you're going to talk about. And then he always asks something out of the blue that you haven't agreed. He does it every damn time. And so he tried that on me. And about, well, what do you think is going to happen? And I said, I haven't got a clue. It's not my job. You have to ask somebody else. And then he asked something else. I said, look, I don't know. And he said, well, what about Dominic Cummings? And we just fell about laughing because... And he said, God, if everyone came on and refused to talk about stuff they didn't know about, we wouldn't have anything to talk about. And then we just had a big laugh about it. And that went down very well. And I realized, this is the way to do it. You do it lightly. You say, no, I'm not going to, it's not like, oh, no comment. So you just say, no, it's not what I do. You have to ask somebody else.
And that reminds me of the famous Donald Rumsfeld quote about, which at the time was pilloried. But the more I think about it,
what a genius! He's
onto something.
He's the great sage of our time. No, I always make jokes about that because but almost by random, he did come up with something really intelligent. Of course, other people have talked about this. Where we can say, what we know, we don't know, and we don't know, we don't know. But the unknown unknowns, we don't know what we don't know, is absolutely important, vital idea. And of course, people have had this idea for ages when they talk about resilience. The point about I like distinguishing between robustness and resilience. Robustness is about the known unknowns. You worked out the shocks that might happen, the uncertainty, and you listed those and worked out that you're robust to those known possible variations. But resilience is about being, be able to function even when the things you never even thought of happened. And so those unknown unknowns. And the point is that, everything we do is full up with unknown unknowns. We cannot list all the possibilities. We cannot know everything we don't know. Some things we know we don't know. A lot of things we don't know we don't. and that's fine. That's fine. As I said, it's built into this, this error term in statistics. It's all the stuff that's unexplainable and that might happen, and we've just got to accept it. That things will happen that we never even thought of, and we need to build that into our structures and our thinking, and not to ever have the arrogance to believe we've thought of everything. We need to have this humility. So it's all built in with humility, with acknowledging the limitations of all analyses. All models are wrong. First thing, absolute starting point. So everything's wrong that we do. Everything's inadequate. Everything's limited. However, it can be quite useful.
One of the things I've heard you talk a lot about is level of confidence.
Mm.
So how am I
Mm.
feeling about this prediction?
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's really interesting. And we're expected to sort of know, you're an expert, you should know stuff.
Yeah. Well, there's two types of what we call direct and indirect uncertainty, which we've written quite a lot about now, and seems to be being accepted more. Is that we're really thinking beyond error bars. I mean, there's two. For the first thing, you can talk, and not just about predictions, but anything. You just give a number, and everyone says, "Well, how do you know? You don't know." So the next stage up, so you might put error bars on that, like vaccine effectiveness. You might get a range, all this. So you put error bars on. Now, even those are uncertain. We don't know because they are dependent upon many assumptions. They're calculated as part, whether confidence interval, some sort of statistical stuff, the sort of things that I've done all my life. But it comes out of a formula, an algorithm that will produce it. And those are dependent on assumptions. And the one thing we do absolutely know is those assumptions are not true. All assumptions are wrong. So we know that. Sometimes, most of the time, it don't matter, but they're never exactly right. So, and other things, we don't, particularly with predictions, of course, there's all sorts of things going to happen we never even thought of. So we've got to express, I feel, it's necessary to express a personal, this is now much more subjective, personal confidence in that interval or in our analysis, in these numbers, in our whole way of thinking. And that is another, again, rather poncy name for it, is the idea of ontological uncertainty, that we are uncertain about the very structure of the way we're thinking about things. I'm trying to think of a better word. People use deep uncertainty or unknown unknowns or something like that. Ontological sounds far too academic, but I still think there must be a better word there that explains that our very conceptualization may be inadequate. Certainly our model structure is inadequate for actually describing reality, the territory rather than a map, which is all we're playing with in terms of our conceptualization. So this is really important, and this is absolutely caught on in area after area. Now people will give an estimate, they'll give an interval, and then they'll talk about a confidence or quality rating or something like that, or a star rating about their whole analysis, and which might include, of course, saying we don't know, we're not even going to give an interval. And people are doing that in medicine, using the grade system. SAGE, in all their analyses now, when they produce an estimate or something like that, or an analysis, they will rank it according to low, medium, or high confidence in the evidence in their analysis. And they use low, medium, and medium high, so a 5-point scale. And UK HSA, when they release their vaccine effectiveness studies, they will talk about low, medium, and confidence in their estimates. And doesn't mean not in the interval, even in the intervals they give it, because of the quality of the data that's available. And so I think this is an enormously powerful idea, this indirect uncertainty, an ability, even if you can do some calculations, to acknowledge, well, they're not very good. And because sometimes they're brilliant, but sometimes actually the data is pretty shifty. It's not quite what we want. We know the data is a bit biased. It's not a random sample. We know there's problems with this. We're not quite sure what they are, but we know there are problems. So we're going to express some humility about our whole analysis. This is enormous progress that's being made, and it's becoming very widespread over the pandemic.
But I think it's super healthy, because if I look at something like a weather forecast, which we've been we know that that's sort of it's a guesstimate. One, because the area it covers. Two, because things can change. And so I sort of look at it, I get a rough indication. But unless it's telling me that, well, even looks at percentage of precipitation, gives me a sense of, they're not telling me, yes, it's going to rain or no, it's not. So we're used to that in other contexts. And I think it's incredibly healthy to have it. And I think dealing with that sort of criticism of, well, you said this was going to happen, I think it's quite helpful as a counterweight to be able to say, well, I said it could happen, But
Hmm.
here's a bit more
Yeah.
context to that.
I think for the weather, it's mainly direct uncertainty. They're actually putting a number on the probability of it raining and things like that, and that's fine. And usually for those, it's a week, 10-day week out. Usually they're common, and there's actually not that much the models that are really very good, and they're tested and they're calibrated. They know that when they say 80%, it actually will rain 80% of the time. So there's very little indirect uncertainty about that. They're pretty confident in those numbers that they're giving, because they've got vast amounts of data, huge experience. There's actually very confident uncertainty. They're confident about their uncertainty measures, they showed me. Now, climate change is a different matter, because what's going to happen in 100 years, they can put probabilities on it and things like that. But actually, they also put a measure of confidence in their analysis, because this is not something, we haven't got the empirical data as weather. You've got endless checks all the time in your predictions, like sports forecasts. And it's constantly been, you can check where you can't in climate. With very little opportunity to test these long-term ones, you can't do it. So I think that those situations are different. The weather is very helpful in terms of just getting people used to what I regard the first level of uncertainty, which are probabilities. And similarly, we would encourage, that's why I really like Danny Finkelstein doing sports predictions, because he'll give probabilities rather than saying who's going to win. You give probabilities, and all the work of Nate Silver in the States, it's all to do with probabilities. He got bollocking because he only gave 30% chance of Trump winning, but he was at the highest, and others were much lower than that. At least he gave 30%. Well, that means, okay, 3 similar elections, Trump wins one and Hillary wins the other 2, is what they're saying. If you're 3 parallel worlds, well, we lived in the world where Trump won. It's not that amazing, frankly. It's not, it wasn't, it could have been better, but it's not that surprising. So you have to, putting numbers on that is incredibly valuable. And then, as I said, in other situations where actually the evidence isn't that great, you also should give some sort of rating about how confident you are even about those numbers.
Speaking of the word numbers, I do want to make sure we talk about COVID by numbers, which is your latest book.
Oh, yeah.
So can you tell us, how did that come about?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was with Anthony Masters. We started writing, got asked to write a column for The Observer. Interesting, in the paper, we were given 300 words to talk about a topic on COVID statistics. And we started in January 2021. And then 50 columns later, we said, please, can we stop? And
Enough now.
it's very popular. It's very popular. So please let us stop. Please we said, right, that's it. We're not doing any more. And they gave us a whole page, which was really nice to finish off with. But every week we wrote 300 words on a COVID statistics topic, and we never had to repeat them. Every week there was something that came up. Quite explaining really quite, one of them, of course, was why most people who die have been vaccinated. But really quite complex stuff on test false positive rates in tests, on pregnancy, and everything, because there was always some numbers in the news which we tried to explain. 300 words is difficult. God, it's twice as difficult as 600.
Well, it's the Twitter problem,
really,
but on a sort of slightly larger scale, in that you've got to constrain it down to something that's still meaningful in a very short space.
Yeah, but it was a great challenge, and Anthony, I think we rose to it, and we made a real effort. And they didn't edit us very much at all, and apparently it was popular. But out of that, then grew, to do a book, which we wrote for Penguin, and that's Pelican, and it's gone down pretty well. I think it needs updating. I'm sure we'll do a second edition. As a paperback, but it was good. A real challenge. I think 26 chapters, all on different topics, and it just made us realize, God, this is why it's been such hard work over 2 years, because there are so many COVID statistics in so many areas. You got the R number, all that kind of stuff. We've got number of people getting infected, and the test, and long COVID, vaccines, and the effectiveness of masks, and all this stuff. It's just this huge amount of and then all the diagnostic testing, test and trace. It's all numerical. It's just It's just staggering how many different areas of stuff. And a lot of what we do, it's not complex stats. A lot it's a lot of it's just trying to work out, well, what does this number actually really mean, and what can we get out?
And it's as you say, it's not complex for these basic things. I think you've made a nice reference in terms of communicating to think about it that's not
Yeah.
a sort of
Oh, an
numerous
aunt,
the wrong word,
an
but
aunt or an uncle is what I always think of who you're trying to explain it to.
it's a very helpful jumping off point to start thinking about some of the other things, some of the other places where we're looking at data and having data presented to us.
Mm, Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, the lessons yeah, absolutely carry over. So, when I give talks on this stuff, and I can use COVID, but especially as I hope COVID's going to go out of fashion a bit, it just fits in with everything else. These are things like two things I've been talking about for ages, and ideas, especially as I say, I mainly now concentrate on this idea of trustworthy communication and use. But there's some really good COVID examples, but some of which we worked on. For example, Jonathan Van Tam explaining a year ago about the risks of these nasty blood clots from the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the fact that the benefits of the vaccine really went right down as you got younger, but the risks of the vaccine went up as you got younger. And so there comes a point where these lines crossed, essentially. And at that point, then was 30, and they said, well, so we're not giving the vaccine to people under 30. And by doing that, by just explaining it to people, the harms and the benefits, using a decent graphic that we help prepare, and taking people through it slowly, and not trying to say, oh, you mustn't, the vaccine's safe. Just saying there are benefits and harms. And for older people, it's quite clear that the benefits massively outweigh the harms. And for younger people, it isn't. And everyone just nodded their head and said, yeah, fine. No fuss, no argument. He was just upfront with everybody. And it was Jonathan Van Tam's good, trusted communicator. He's got his own really good style. And it was brilliant masterclass in trustworthy communication of treating the audience with respect, as if they're grown-ups. I'm going to explain this to you, and this is why we've come to our conclusion, and we think this is actually pretty self-evident. And everyone just nodded their heads and agreed, right across the spectrum.
What are your top tips for us if we're being told something? What should we be thinking about in terms of trustworthiness?
Oh yeah, it's good. Tim Harford's got a really good. His list is good. He's got a top 10 as well. And his first one is, how does it make me feel? Look inside yourself. Is your emotional reaction to this number? I think that's very good. I like that. I feel I can't steal it because he thought. But my equivalent that I was using before is, why am I hearing this? So I look into the motivation of the communicator. Why is somebody telling me? So, which immediately brings it around to the trustworthiness of the source. I always look at the source before I look at the number, because if the source is, depending on who it is, I will change my judgment. If I know it's Office for National Statistics, I'll have one approach. If I know, well, some of the worst offenders, if I know it's some campaigning organization, the Daily Skeptic or something like that, then I know immediately not to believe. Then it's just a detective work of why what they're doing is wrong. So that's the first. Why are they wrong? But in between, charities tend to be a bit iffy often, and they've got a line they're trying to push, so they can be a bit. So why am I hearing this? And also, what does this person make me want to feel? Are they trying to persuade me? What are they trying to persuade me of? The other thing, is more subtle. Is what am I not being told? Missing. That's really difficult. It's the dog that didn't bark in the night. Trying to identify what isn't there, and that is quite a skill that I think many statisticians pick up from refereeing endless medical papers, and you look for what isn't being talked about. Like how many things did they look at before they showed you? The crucial thing is they tell you an answer. How many other things did they look at that they're not telling you?
Right.
Because that changes everything. If they've trawled to, so people say, I saw one thing. Well, women eating yogurt when they're pregnant, the kids, their babies, an increased risk of asthma. I think that was one of them. And then you realize that they looked through everything people had in pregnancy and every possible outcome of the children and found asthma and yogurt and watched the paper on that. And at that point, you think, oh, Christ, it's really terrible. So you have to, that is a particular skill that requires it's almost real cynicism to have a go at it. But, all these things are done almost before even looking at the number. And then, when you actually want to look at the number, then there are the skills you want to work out. Well, can I believe this number? How rigorous is it? How was it? What's the study design? Things like that. But then I think the one most important thing it's not just is the number reasonable, but are the claims being made on the basis of that number reasonable? The number might be fine, but then they make some claim about, well, therefore this means blah blah blah. We should do this. People shouldn't drink. People should do X. Well, where did that come from? The trustworthiness of the claims, which often don't match, aren't justified, is another element as well. So I look for the trustworthiness of the source, of the number, and of the claims. Those are my three things.
Fantastic. And for listeners that haven't heard, Tim Harford was on the show talking about exactly these things. So I'll put a link to that one in the show notes. Sits as a beautiful companion episode to this one. David, final question. I know you've done quite a lot of work on public inquiries, and I'm assuming you're ready to be called to the COVID one as and when.
Well, God, no, I don't know what they're going to do with their stance. I haven't heard, because yes, I mean, the public inquiries I've worked on, I've all had dedicated statistical teams, quite substantial teams. There was the Bristol babies inquiry, and then the Harold Shipman inquiry, and now I'm working on the infected blood inquiry. I like working in these areas because it's high profile work that requires real statistical dedication to look at, and often going back quite a long time. I don't know what the COVID inquiry is going to do. Who are they going to find? Because it's I don't think they've quite realized, the people doing it, just how massively statistical the issues and the arguments will be. And I don't know what they're planning. Are they going to plan to have their own team? Who are they going to find who hasn't already been up to their ears in COVID? Who are these statisticians around?
Maybe some people on Twitter that have newly found the art of research can help us.
Yeah. They could get those in. I've done my own research. So I don't know what they're going to do. I'm not sure they quite grasped just how statistical issues and the arguments.
Well, I'll tell you, my heuristic's going to be, if you're not willing to get involved in it, I'm going to be deeply suspicious of it. And your involvement will give me some confidence that they're actually trying to take it seriously. So I'll be looking out for that one.
Oh, I'm going to keep my head right down, I think.
David, I could keep talking forever. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to say thank you on a number of notes. Firstly, obviously, for being on the show and being a fantastic guest. Secondly, for the work that you do. I often say this to guests, but I genuinely mean it in your case. The number of times I've listened to you on the radio or seen you and just found you making sense of things and sort of taking particularly shows where they sort of try and have on the one hand, on the other, and false equivalents. Yeah. It's so nice to have someone cutting through the bullshit and speaking plain English and making things clear and using examples that we can all understand. So I'm hugely grateful that you're there and that you are willing to go into that public forum and have these conversations, because it certainly adds to everybody's comprehension and I think therefore makes the world a better place.
Well, it's really kind of the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me.
Meant in its entirety. I will put links to your books, all of which come highly recommended. There are also a ton of videos and other places where people can see and hear you. I recommend a few of those for people to get diving into. But as people can tell from the conversation, you're an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
No, thanks. Really, just giving me a chance to rant on it. What a pleasure.
That's my kind of ranting. Love it.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to David for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about David, his research and his books, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. I'd also like to add my thanks to Roger Miles for helping to make this happen. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To catch up with past episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Thanks for listening. And remember, as David says, anytime anyone's using numbers to try and convince you of something, be highly suspicious. Thanks for listening.